The moment you discover what someone chose to hide instead of what they chose to say, your entire life can collapse in a single heartbeat. Adrian Blackwood had repeated those words countless times to the young captains who worked beneath him, treating them as another lesson about loyalty, deception, and survival. He never imagined they would become the sentence that unraveled his own future. Rain rolled across the windshield of his black SUV as downtown Ashford disappeared beneath a curtain of grey, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. His phone buzzed again. Charlotte Hayes. His fiancée. The elegant engagement dinner was less than 3 hours away, and she had already sent 4 messages asking when he would arrive. Adrian glanced at the screen, silenced the notification, and turned into the cracked parking lot of a worn apartment building tucked between an aging laundromat and a family-owned grocery store. The place looked exactly as he remembered, only smaller, older, and somehow lonelier. 5 years had passed since Ethan Carter walked out of his life without offering an explanation anyone believed. 5 years since Adrian convinced himself that forgetting was easier than asking questions whose answers might hurt more than betrayal. He wasn't here for closure. At least, that was what he kept telling himself. Earlier that morning, one of his attorneys had discovered that Ethan's lease still listed Adrian as an emergency contact, an outdated legal detail that could complicate several financial records before Adrian's marriage. One signature. One conversation. One final goodbye. Then Ethan would disappear from his life forever. Adrian stepped out into the cool October air, straightened the charcoal overcoat hanging across his broad shoulders, and climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs that smelled faintly of old paint and fresh coffee. Apartment 3B waited at the end of the hallway. The brass numbers were slightly crooked, and a tiny ceramic sunflower hung beside the door, faded by years of sunlight. Ethan always loved small things that made ordinary places feel like home. Adrian raised his hand and knocked once. No answer. He waited. Knocked again. Silence settled over the hallway until he heard only the distant hum of an elevator somewhere below. He checked his watch. If Ethan wasn't home, he would leave the paperwork with the building manager and never return. That should have been enough. Then he noticed the envelope tucked beneath the welcome mat. Final notice. The bold letters caught his attention immediately. Rent overdue. Utilities scheduled for disconnection. Adrian frowned. Ethan had always insisted on paying every bill before buying anything for himself. Something about the envelope felt wrong. The superintendent appeared from the neighboring apartment carrying a toolbox. You looking for Ethan? The older man asked gently. Adrian nodded once. He hasn't been around for a couple days. Said if anyone important came by. The superintendent hesitated before reaching into his pocket and holding out a spare key. He told me to let them inside. He said the apartment would explain everything better than he ever could. Adrian stared at the key resting in the man's weathered palm. Somewhere across town, musicians were probably rehearsing for the celebration waiting that evening. Charlotte was choosing flowers. Guests were preparing champagne toasts. Yet as Adrian wrapped his fingers around the cold brass key, an unfamiliar weight settled across his chest. He unlocked the apartment door, pushed it open, and took one quiet step inside, never realizing that before the sun set, he would no longer be a man walking toward his wedding, but a man running from the life he thought he wanted. The apartment was impossibly quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that came after a long day, but the kind that settled over places where someone had been carrying burdens alone for far too long. Adrian remained just inside the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the soft afternoon light filtering through faded curtains. Nothing about the room matched the version of Ethan he had frozen in his memory 5 years earlier. There was no expensive furniture, no signs of comfort, no trace of the bright optimism Ethan used to carry wherever he went. Instead, every corner reflected careful restraint. A patched sofa sat against one wall with a neatly folded blanket resting across its back. The dining table was barely large enough for 2 people, its surface polished until it almost looked new despite countless scratches hidden beneath the finish. A tiny bookshelf held worn novels, a stack of library books, and a ceramic mug filled with colored pencils that had been sharpened with remarkable care. Everything was clean. Everything had its place. Yet every object whispered the same silent truth. Someone here had learned how to survive without wasting a single dollar. Adrian slowly walked farther inside. The air carried the faint scent of fresh laundry mixed with cinnamon, as though someone had baked cookies several days ago, and the warmth still lingered in the walls. On the kitchen counter sat a handwritten grocery list. Milk. Eggs. Bread. Apples. Cough medicine. The final item caught his attention. Ethan almost never got sick. He remembered Ethan laughing whenever everyone else caught the seasonal flu, claiming his immune system refused to take vacations. Adrian frowned and looked toward the small refrigerator. Family photos were held in place with inexpensive magnets shaped like stars and tiny houses. At first he barely glanced at them. Then his steps stopped. Every photograph had been carefully trimmed. Someone standing beside Ethan had been cut away from every single picture. Only Ethan remained, smiling with quiet determination, standing in parks, beside lakes, outside a modest bakery, always leaving an empty space where another person had clearly once existed. Adrian reached toward one photograph but hesitated before touching it. Why erase someone instead of throwing the picture away completely? His attention shifted as he noticed several framed children's drawings taped neatly along the hallway wall. Bright suns. Blue birds. Green trees. Stick figures holding hands beneath oversized rainbows. One drawing showed a tall man in a dark suit standing beside a smaller figure with light brown hair. Above them, written in uneven block letters, were the words, "My hero." Adrian stared at the picture longer than he intended. Ethan had never been particularly artistic. He smiled faintly, almost expecting to hear Ethan apologize for crooked lines the way he used to years ago. But these drawings did not look like Ethan's work. The handwriting belonged to a child. A slow uneasiness settled deeper into his chest. He continued toward the living room where a small wooden shelf displayed a collection of carefully organized envelopes secured with paper clips. Utility receipts. Medical invoices. Insurance statements. Every bill had been paid eventually, but nearly all of them showed overdue notices before the final payment date. Ethan had been balancing every expense with impossible precision. Adrian quietly opened one kitchen cabinet looking for nothing in particular. Inside sat neatly labeled containers holding rice, pasta, oatmeal, and canned soup. No expensive coffee. No unnecessary snacks. Only practical food stretched as far as possible. He closed the cabinet and leaned lightly against the counter. 5 years ago Ethan had dreamed about opening a bookstore with a coffee corner where neighbors could spend entire afternoons reading. That dream seemed unimaginably distant now. His phone vibrated once more inside his coat pocket. Charlotte again. Another message asking whether he had left the office yet. Adrian looked at the glowing screen before locking it without reading another word. Something inside this apartment demanded more attention than the elegant evening waiting across town. As he turned toward the bedroom hallway, his eyes caught one final detail almost hidden beneath the narrow console table beside the entrance. A pair of tiny sneakers, neatly cleaned and carefully placed side by side, far too small to belong to Ethan, rested beneath an umbrella stand as though someone expected their owner to return home at any moment. Adrian stood perfectly still, his heartbeat slowing instead of racing, because some instincts did not arrive like thunder. Sometimes they arrived as a whisper, quietly telling you that every answer you believed for years had just become the wrong question. Adrian forced himself to keep walking, although every instinct told him to stop before whatever truth waited deeper inside the apartment could reach him. The narrow hallway led to a modest bedroom where the bed had been made with military precision, the comforter smoothed carefully across the mattress as though Ethan had wanted the room to appear peaceful even when no one was there to see it. A single reading lamp stood beside the bed, next to an old hardcover novel with a folded receipt serving as a bookmark. The receipt was only 3 days old. Ethan had been here recently. Relief flickered through Adrian for the briefest moment before another detail stole his attention. A wooden storage box rested beneath the bed, its edge barely visible beneath the hanging comforter. It was not hidden very well. It looked almost intentionally left where someone could eventually find it. Adrian slowly knelt and pulled the box into the light. The lid was secured only by a simple cloth ribbon. No lock. No warning. Just a small handwritten note taped to the top. If you are reading this, then maybe the truth finally found its way to you. Adrian recognized the handwriting immediately. Even after 5 years, Ethan still curved the last letter of every sentence the same way. His pulse became unsteady as he untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. The first item resting inside was a neatly folded baby blanket, pale blue with tiny embroidered stars stitched along the edges. It had clearly been washed countless times, yet someone had repaired a loose corner by hand with careful, uneven stitches. Beneath it lay a small pair of knitted mittens no larger than Adrian's palm. He frowned, unable to understand why Ethan had kept such personal belongings inside a memory box. Then he saw the hospital wristband. It had faded with time, but the printing remained readable. Patient, Ethan Carter. Department, Maternity and Family Care. Admission date, 5 years earlier. Adrian stared at the date until the numbers blurred together. 5 years. Exactly 5 years. His breathing slowed. His thoughts refused to move. Carefully, almost afraid of touching anything else, he lifted the wristband aside. Underneath rested several ultrasound photographs preserved inside clear protective sleeves. The images themselves were impossible for him to interpret, but someone had written small notes beneath each picture in blue ink. 8 weeks. 12 weeks. 20 weeks. Heartbeat strong today. The final sentence was underlined twice. Adrian closed his eyes for only a second before opening them again, hoping he had somehow misunderstood what he was seeing. Instead, another envelope slid partially free from beneath the photographs. Across the front Ethan had written only one sentence. Letters I never had the courage to send. Adrian hesitated before opening it. Inside were dozens of folded pages arranged by date. He unfolded the earliest letter with trembling hands. Dear Adrian, today I found out I am going to become a parent. I wanted to tell you first. I practiced saying the words all morning. I even stood outside your office for almost an hour. But before I could come inside, I saw reporters asking questions about your engagement rumors. You looked so happy talking about the future. I convinced myself that my news would only become another burden for you. So I walked away. Adrian lowered the page, unable to breathe for several long seconds. His engagement rumors. Charlotte. 5 years ago. The dates collided inside his mind with unbearable precision. He reached for another letter. This one had never been mailed either. Today I heard people say I trapped you for money. They laughed because they believed you would never choose someone like me. I wanted to defend both of us, but silence seemed kinder than starting another war. I decided our child deserved peace more than I deserved to be understood. Adrian's fingers tightened around the paper until it crumpled slightly. Every assumption he had carried for years began collapsing one after another. Ethan had never demanded recognition. Never contacted the media. Never asked for financial support. Never interrupted Adrian's carefully built career. Instead, he had disappeared completely. Not to punish him. To protect him. Adrian looked back into the box. Resting beneath the letters was a framed photograph turned face down. He slowly picked it up and turned it over. The picture showed Ethan sitting on a blanket beneath a maple tree, smiling with quiet exhaustion while a small child leaned comfortably against his shoulder holding an open picture book. The little boy could not have been older than 4. His soft brown hair belonged to Ethan. But his eyes. Adrian felt the room tilt beneath him. Those unmistakable silver-grey eyes had looked back at him in the mirror every morning of his adult life. Adrian remained frozen on the bedroom floor, the photograph trembling in his hands as memories he had buried beneath years of certainty began forcing their way back into the light. The little boy's smile should have belonged to a stranger, yet every familiar detail refused to let Adrian deny what his heart had already recognized. The slight tilt of the head. The thoughtful expression in those unmistakable silver-grey eyes. Even as a child, he carried the same quiet intensity Adrian had seen in his own childhood photographs. His gaze drifted back to Ethan's peaceful smile in the picture, and for the first time in years Adrian realized he had forgotten what genuine happiness looked like on Ethan's face. The apartment around him slowly faded as another afternoon from 5 years earlier returned with startling clarity. Ethan had stood outside Blackwood Holdings carrying a small gift bag decorated with tiny yellow stars. Adrian remembered noticing him through the glass entrance while finishing a meeting with investors. Ethan had smiled the moment their eyes met. It had been the hopeful smile of someone carrying wonderful news. Adrian had intended to step outside after the meeting ended, but before he could leave the conference room, Charlotte had arrived unexpectedly with members of both families to discuss a public charity gala. Reporters gathered near the entrance almost immediately, cameras flashing as questions echoed through the lobby about rumors of a political alliance between the Hayes and Blackwood families. Adrian had answered cautiously, saying only that discussions about the future were ongoing. He never noticed Ethan quietly lowering the gift bag before turning away into the crowd. He had assumed Ethan simply changed his mind about visiting. He never chased after him. Weeks later, another memory surfaced. Adrian had received an anonymous package containing several blurry photographs showing Ethan speaking with a lawyer outside a family courthouse. His advisors immediately warned him that Ethan was probably preparing legal action or attempting to gain financial leverage before the engagement became official. Adrian had confronted Ethan that evening without allowing him to explain. He could still hear the cold certainty in his own voice. If this is about money, my attorneys will handle it. If this is about revenge, you chose the wrong man. Ethan had stood silently beneath the streetlights, his eyes glistening with disappointment rather than anger. He had opened his mouth several times as though searching for words, but none came. Finally he had simply nodded and whispered, "I hope one day you learn the whole story." Adrian remembered interpreting that sentence as manipulation. He had walked away before Ethan could say anything else. Now the memory struck him with unbearable force. Ethan had not been leaving a lawyer's office at all. Adrian reached into the box again until he found a folded legal document. Across the top were the words, "Voluntary Guardianship Declaration." Ethan had visited the courthouse to prepare emergency custody paperwork in case something happened during the pregnancy. The date matched the photograph exactly. Adrian slowly covered his face with one hand. Every piece of evidence he once believed had been twisted by assumptions he never questioned. He continued reading another unfinished letter. "I almost told you today. I waited outside your office again because our baby kicked for the first time. I thought maybe if you felt it too, everything would become simple again. Then I remembered the look in your eyes the last time we spoke. You already believed I wanted something from you. I realized that asking you to believe me would only make your life harder. So I chose silence one more time." Adrian lowered the page as regret settled over him with crushing weight. Ethan had returned again and again, carrying hope instead of demands, only to leave each time believing Adrian deserved peace more than he deserved the truth. His phone vibrated once more, the bright screen illuminating the dim bedroom. Charlotte's newest message appeared across the display. "Everyone is waiting. I cannot wait to begin our forever tonight." Adrian stared at the words without blinking before locking the phone once again. For the first time since agreeing to marry Charlotte, the future he had spent years building no longer felt solid. It felt like a carefully constructed house standing on a foundation that had quietly disappeared beneath his feet. Adrian could no longer tell whether the silence filling the apartment belonged to the empty rooms or to the weight settling inside his own heart. He reached deeper into the memory box, almost afraid of what another page might reveal, yet unable to stop. Beneath the letters rested a thick bundle of receipts held together with a faded rubber band. None of them were extraordinary by themselves. Pediatric appointments. Prescription medicine. Physical therapy visits. School registration fees. Winter coats purchased one size larger so they would last another season. Every receipt had been carefully dated, every payment recorded in Ethan's familiar handwriting. Besides several entries, Ethan had scribbled small notes to himself. Wait until next paycheck. Skip new shoes this month. Library books are free. Make Noah smile on his birthday no matter what. Adrian read each line slowly, realizing that the little boy in the photograph finally had a name. Noah. He whispered it under his breath without realizing he had spoken aloud. The name sounded strangely familiar, as though it had always belonged somewhere inside him. Another envelope slipped loose from the stack. Inside was a folded report card decorated with colorful stickers. Noah Carter. Kindergarten. Excellent reading skills. Kind to classmates. Loves helping others. Adrian found himself smiling despite the ache growing inside his chest. Ethan always believed kindness mattered more than talent. Apparently, he had taught his son the same lesson. As he placed the report card aside, something small fell onto the wooden floor with a soft tap. It was a friendship bracelet made from blue and gray thread. Attached to it was a tiny folded note written in uneven childish handwriting. For Mommy. Thank you for always fixing everything. I will help you when I grow big. Adrian closed his eyes. The bracelet weighed almost nothing, yet it felt heavier than every business contract he had ever signed. Ethan had never lived in luxury. He had never demanded recognition. Instead, he had spent 5 years quietly building a safe home where a little boy could grow surrounded by love instead of resentment. Adrian continued searching through the box until he discovered a notebook with worn corners. It was not a diary. It was a planner filled with carefully organized schedules. Doctor appointments. School pickup times. Grocery budgets. Reading hour every Tuesday. Park on Saturday if weather allows. Movie night every first Friday of the month. Every page reflected the same quiet determination to create stability from almost nothing. Then one entry stopped him completely. October 14th. Noah asked again why other children have fathers at school events. Told him every family looks different. Promised that someday he would understand the whole story. I hope I did not lie to him. Adrian stared at the sentence until his vision blurred. Ethan had never poisoned Noah against him. He had never painted Adrian as a villain. Even after years of silence and misunderstanding, Ethan had protected Adrian's place in their son's future without expecting anything in return. A folded newspaper clipping rested inside the final page of the planner. It featured Adrian standing beside Charlotte at a charity fundraiser, both smiling for cameras beneath a headline celebrating one of the city's most influential couples. Across the edge of the article, Ethan had written only a single sentence. I truly hope he found the happiness I could not give him. Adrian lowered the clipping with trembling hands. Ethan had watched his life from a distance all these years, never interfering, never exposing the truth, choosing instead to wish him happiness while carrying every burden alone. The realization left Adrian feeling smaller than he had ever felt inside any boardroom or negotiation. His phone rang again, this time filling the apartment with an almost jarring sound. Charlotte's name illuminated the screen once more. Adrian let it ring until the call ended by itself. A voicemail notification appeared immediately afterward, but he could not bring himself to listen. His attention shifted toward the hallway where the tiny sneakers still waited patiently beneath the umbrella stand. They no longer looked like forgotten shoes. They looked like evidence of countless ordinary mornings Ethan had created through sacrifice, careful planning, and quiet love. Adrian slowly stood, carrying the planner, the bracelet, and the photograph in his hands. For years he had believed strength meant protecting an empire, making impossible decisions, and never looking back. Standing inside Ethan's modest apartment, surrounded by proof of 5 years of silent devotion, Adrian finally understood that the strongest person he had ever known had never built an empire at all. He had simply built a home. Adrian carried the memory box back into the living room and placed it gently on the small dining table, as though every letter inside had become something too valuable to risk damaging. Outside, the rain continued tapping softly against the windows, but inside the apartment another storm had already begun. It was the quiet kind that reshaped a person without making a sound. His eyes wandered across the room once more, noticing details he had overlooked when he first arrived. A growth chart had been penciled carefully along the inside edge of the kitchen doorway. Every few inches another date appeared beside a tiny horizontal line. Age 3. Age 4. First day of kindergarten. Adrian rested his fingertips against the highest mark. Noah had been growing here while Adrian spent those same years expanding businesses, attending charity galas, and convincing himself that success could replace the parts of his life he no longer questioned. On the bookshelf he discovered another photo frame tucked between children's storybooks. This one showed Ethan sitting on a park bench while Noah proudly held a homemade kite high above his head. Written across the bottom in black ink were the words, "We finally got it to fly today." Mommy laughed louder than the wind. Adrian smiled despite himself before the smile disappeared almost immediately. He had missed every one of those ordinary moments. Every birthday. Every scraped knee that had needed comforting. Every bedtime story. Every first achievement that deserved applause. None of those memories could ever be recreated. They belonged to the years he had chosen not to look back. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the still open apartment door. The superintendent stood there holding a reusable grocery bag. "I almost forgot," the older man said kindly. "Ethan asked me to water his plants if he stayed away longer than expected. He worries about those little herbs more than most people worry about expensive furniture." Adrian looked toward the windowsill where several small pots of basil, rosemary, and mint reached toward the fading afternoon light. Their leaves were healthy despite the modest apartment around them. "Where did he go?" Adrian asked quietly. The superintendent hesitated before setting the grocery bag beside the kitchen counter. "I honestly do not know. He got a phone call 2 nights ago. Packed a small suitcase. Picked Noah up from school early yesterday morning. He only said it was important and that they might be gone for a little while." Adrian felt another question rising immediately. Was he happy here? The older man smiled with surprising warmth. "He worked harder than anyone I have ever met. Early mornings at the bakery. Evening bookkeeping for a local hardware store. Sometimes he barely slept. But whenever Noah came home, it was like someone turned all the lights back on." He glanced toward the children's drawings covering the hallway wall. "That little boy thinks his mother can fix absolutely anything." Adrian lowered his eyes. "He can," the superintendent replied before Adrian could speak again. "Maybe not everything. But he never stopped trying." After the older man quietly left, Adrian remained standing in the kitchen, absorbing those simple words. Ethan had never become bitter. He had never allowed disappointment to define the home Noah grew up in. Instead, he had chosen hope every single day, even when no one was watching. Adrian finally picked up the voicemail notification that had been waiting on his phone. Charlotte's cheerful voice immediately filled the apartment. "Everyone is asking where you are. The photographer is already here, and my parents keep checking the clock. Please tell me you are on your way. Tonight is the beginning of the rest of our lives." When the message ended, Adrian stared silently at the dark screen. For years he had believed his future began with the ceremony waiting across town. Now that future felt strangely distant, almost belonging to another version of himself who had never opened the apartment door. His gaze settled on the photograph of Noah once more. The little boy's silver-grey eyes seemed almost impossibly familiar, not because they looked like Adrian's, but because they reflected the quiet kindness Ethan had protected all these years. Adrian slipped the photograph carefully into the inside pocket of his coat before closing the memory box. There were still questions without answers. There were still years that could never be returned. But one truth had become impossible to ignore. The man he thought he had left behind had never stopped carrying a place for him in their story, while Adrian had spent 5 years living inside a lie that he had built with his own unquestioned certainty. Adrian locked the apartment door behind him with slow, deliberate movements, carefully returning the spare key to the superintendent before stepping back into the cool evening air. The rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks shimmering beneath the city lights. He stood beside his SUV without opening the driver's door, his reflection staring back at him from the rain-speckled window. For years he had believed that every important decision in life could be made with logic, preparation, and absolute confidence. Yet none of those qualities could tell him how to carry the weight of a little blue bracelet resting inside his coat pocket. His phone began ringing again before he even started the engine. This time it was not Charlotte. It was his younger cousin, Daniel Blackwood. Adrian answered without speaking. "Where are you?" Daniel asked immediately. "The ballroom is full. Charlotte's parents are greeting guests, and everyone keeps asking why the guest of honor is missing." Adrian glanced toward the apartment building one last time before quietly saying, "I will be there soon." The drive across the city felt longer than it ever had before. Every traffic light gave him another moment to remember something he had ignored. A children's bookstore reminded him of Ethan's forgotten dream. A neighborhood park made him imagine Noah learning to ride a bicycle while Adrian attended another business meeting. Every ordinary family he passed became another silent reminder that time had continued moving without him. When he finally arrived at the Hayes Grand Hotel, attendants hurried to open his car door. The entrance glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, fresh white flowers lined the marble staircase, and a string quartet played elegant music that floated through the lobby. Everything looked exactly the way Adrian had planned it months earlier. Perfect. Predictable. Prestigious. It suddenly felt completely unfamiliar. Daniel met him near the entrance with obvious relief. "There you are. Charlotte has been trying to reach you for hours." Adrian nodded absent-mindedly while adjusting his coat. As he entered the ballroom, conversation softened almost immediately. Hundreds of guests turned toward him with warm smiles and raised glasses. Business leaders, city officials, longtime family friends, all waiting to celebrate what they believed was the beginning of an extraordinary future. At the center of the room stood Charlotte Hayes wearing an elegant ivory gown that reflected the golden light above. She smiled the moment she saw him and walked forward with genuine happiness shining across her face. "You finally made it," she whispered as she reached for his hands. "I was starting to worry." Adrian looked into her eyes and realized something painful. Charlotte had done nothing wrong. She had believed in the same future he had promised to build together. She deserved honesty, not another carefully rehearsed performance. She noticed the change in his expression almost immediately. "Adrian, what happened?" she asked softly. The musicians continued playing while conversations resumed around them, unaware that the evening had already begun changing course. Adrian gently released her hands. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I owe you the truth before we take another step." Her smile slowly faded. "You are frightening me." Adrian lowered his voice so only she could hear. "I cannot stand here and promise you forever when I have just discovered that my past was built on a lie I chose to believe." Confusion filled her face. "What are you talking about?" He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew the worn photograph of Ethan and Noah. He looked at it for only a second before returning it safely to his pocket. "There are people whose lives I abandoned because I never searched for the truth. I learned that only a few hours ago." Charlotte remained silent, studying him carefully. She had known Adrian long enough to recognize the difference between uncertainty and absolute conviction. This was the latter. "Is this about Ethan?" she asked almost in a whisper. Adrian closed his eyes briefly before answering. "Yes." Another long silence settled between them. Finally Charlotte gave a slow, heartbreaking nod. "Do you still love him?" Adrian did not answer immediately because the question itself no longer felt complete. Love was only part of what stood before him now. There was regret. Responsibility. A little boy with silver-grey eyes. 5 years that could never be reclaimed. He opened his eyes and met Charlotte's gaze with quiet honesty. I do not know what the future looks like anymore. But I know I cannot marry you while another family is carrying the consequences of my mistakes. Charlotte looked away for a moment, collecting herself with remarkable grace. When she faced him again, tears shimmered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. Then do not make another promise you cannot keep. Adrian gave a small, grateful nod before removing the engagement ring from his finger. Around them, the celebration continued for several more seconds, completely unaware that before the first toast could even begin, the future everyone had gathered to celebrate had already come to an end. The ballroom faded behind Adrian as if it belonged to another lifetime. He ignored the shocked expressions, the whispers spreading through the crowd, and the calls of family members asking him to stop. None of it mattered anymore. The only sound that remained clear in his mind was the quiet sentence Ethan had written inside one of the letters. I hope one day you learn the whole story. Adrian stepped into the cool night air, loosened the tie around his neck, and stood beneath the hotel entrance for several long moments before pulling out his phone. This time he did not call an attorney or a business associate. He called the only person who had quietly remained loyal to him for more than a decade. Marcus, he said as soon as the call connected. I need your help. His chief of security answered without hesitation. Tell me what you need. Find Ethan Carter and a little boy named Noah. I do not want investigators frightening them. I do not want reporters involved. I want every search handled with respect. If Ethan does not want to see me, no one pressures him. We simply find them. Marcus remained silent for a moment before replying, understood. Where do I begin? Adrian looked back toward the glowing ballroom one final time before turning away. The bakery where Ethan worked. Noah's school. The apartment superintendent. Every place they called home. Less than an hour later, Adrian parked outside the neighborhood bakery shown in several of Ethan's photographs. The lights were off, but a middle-aged woman was locking the front door after finishing the evening cleanup. Adrian approached slowly. Excuse me. I am looking for Ethan Carter. The woman's warm expression immediately softened. You just missed him by 2 days. Adrian felt his heart sink. Do you know where he went? She shook her head. He told everyone Noah needed a little adventure before school started again. He smiled when he said it, but... She hesitated. He looked worried. More worried than I had ever seen him. Adrian thanked her quietly before asking another question. What kind of person was Ethan here? The woman smiled through tired eyes. The kind who brought extra bread home because he knew another family on this block could not always afford dinner. The kind who stayed late to help teenagers learn how to decorate cakes before graduation parties. The kind who apologized whenever he took a sick day even though everyone knew he worked harder than the rest of us combined. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Every answer seemed to reveal another version of Ethan he had never bothered to know. The following morning, Adrian visited Noah's elementary school. The principal welcomed him politely after confirming his identity. When Adrian explained that he was searching for Ethan, the principal folded her hands thoughtfully. Noah is one of the brightest children we have ever taught, she said with a smile. Always kind. Always sharing. Whenever another student sat alone during lunch, Noah would quietly bring over his own chair. Adrian felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. Was Ethan involved with the school? The principal laughed softly. Every volunteer event. Every reading day. Every science fair. If another parent could not attend because of work, Ethan usually stayed to cheer for their child too. She opened a filing cabinet before removing a colorful folder. Noah left this behind. Adrian accepted the folder carefully. Inside were drawings, spelling tests, and a simple family assignment titled, My Greatest Hero. Noah had drawn Ethan wearing an apron with flour on his clothes and a bright smile across his face. Beneath the picture he had written, "My mommy always tells me that being strong means helping people even when nobody is watching. I want to be just like him." Adrian lowered the paper slowly, unable to stop imagining the countless evenings Ethan must have spent teaching Noah those values, one quiet conversation at a time. As Adrian prepared to leave, the principal remembered something. There was one unusual thing before they left. Adrian looked up immediately. "What was it?" Noah asked if there were mountains somewhere nearby where the leaves turned bright red in the fall. Ethan smiled and told him they might finally get to see them together. Adrian felt his pulse quicken for the first time all day. Mountains with autumn colors. It was not much. It was barely a clue at all. But after days of discovering only the past, it was finally the first small piece pointing toward where Ethan and Noah might still be waiting somewhere ahead. 3 hours later, Marcus called with the first real lead. "We found a reservation made yesterday under Ethan Carter's name," he said. "It is a small family lodge outside Maple Ridge National Forest, about 180 miles north of the city. The reservation is only for 2 nights. Adrian tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Do not send anyone ahead of me," he replied. "If Ethan sees a security team, he might leave before I arrive." "Understood," Marcus answered. "Drive safely." The highway stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted with fading shades of orange and crimson. Every mile carried Adrian farther away from the life he had spent years building and closer to the one he should have protected from the very beginning. For the first time in years, he was not racing toward another business deal or another carefully planned event. He was simply hoping he was not already too late. As the city disappeared behind him, forests gradually replaced concrete buildings. The air became cooler, cleaner, carrying the unmistakable scent of pine trees drifting through the open window. Ethan had always loved autumn. Adrian suddenly remembered a conversation from years ago when they had shared hot chocolate on a quiet October evening. Ethan had smiled and said that one day he wanted to watch red leaves fall somewhere so peaceful that all the world could hear was the wind. Adrian had laughed back then, promising they would go someday. Like so many promises, he had forgotten. Ethan never had. Shortly after sunset, Adrian reached the small mountain town. Maple Ridge was little more than a collection of family-owned shops, a cozy diner, a gas station, and a handful of cabins surrounded by towering maple trees glowing beneath the last light of day. Everything moved at an unhurried pace, completely untouched by the frantic rhythm of the city. Adrian parked outside the lodge and stepped inside. A cheerful woman behind the front desk greeted him with a welcoming smile. "Can I help you?" Adrian removed the photograph from his coat pocket and gently placed it on the counter. "I am looking for these 2 people." The woman studied the picture before her expression brightened with recognition. "Yes. They checked in yesterday morning." Adrian felt his heartbeat quicken. "Are they still here?" She nodded. "They went hiking after breakfast. There is an easy trail behind the lake. Families love it because the overlook has the prettiest view of the autumn trees." Adrian thanked her quietly and hurried back outside. The trail wound gently through towering maples whose scarlet and golden leaves drifted lazily onto the path. The forest was peaceful enough that every footstep sounded unusually loud. Adrian walked for nearly 20 minutes before the trees began to thin near a scenic overlook. Children's laughter floated softly through the crisp afternoon air. He stopped immediately. The sound came from somewhere just beyond a cluster of bright red maples. Adrian stepped forward carefully until the view opened before him. There, overlooking the valley, stood Ethan wearing a simple brown sweater and jeans, kneeling beside a little boy who was trying with determined concentration to launch a colorful kite into the gentle mountain breeze. Ethan laughed as the kite dipped awkwardly before finally catching the wind. It climbed higher and higher while Noah clapped his hands with pure delight. Adrian remained hidden behind the trees, unable to move. This was the life Ethan had built without wealth, without influence, without recognition. It was quiet. Ordinary. Beautiful. Noah suddenly turned toward the trail, chasing the kite string as it drifted closer to Adrian's side of the clearing. Before Ethan could call him back, the little boy looked up and noticed the tall stranger standing beneath the maple trees. For a brief second neither of them spoke. Noah tilted his head curiously, studying Adrian's face with those unmistakable silver-grey eyes. Then he smiled with innocent politeness, exactly the way Ethan had taught him, and called back toward the overlook in a clear, cheerful voice that echoed gently across the valley. "Mommy, there is a nice man here watching our kite."